Yeah, this presentation is going to cover a lot. We're going to talk to you and tell you about real life so you have a really in-depth understanding of what we do, why we do it, how we do it, because it's all principles that are a part of evidence-based practices, which are things that you, of course, can implement. We are going to make sure that you have a full knowledge of trauma and what trauma-informed care is and a way to apply it. And then we will get to the topic of this actual presentation, which is family. But without the former two things I mentioned, nothing with the family implementation is going to be the most effective that it can be. What we are not going to have time to talk about today is execution. We're going to give you all the pieces of the puzzle, but we're not going to help you put them together today. We just don't have time. But hopefully with all the puzzle pieces, you'll be able to figure out how to make it work wherever you are, because clearly we know what might work for you might not work for you, depending on your facility and your location. So with that said, we'd like to start with what's our goal and why? Why do we do what we do? Clearly we know. We are in this for a passion, but not everybody knows. So just a couple of statistics. The basics of it is there are a lot of people locked up in our country. A lot of people have misdemeanors. A lot of people have felony records. There are millions of people currently in recovery and even more millions of people that are currently active battling their substance use disorder. But you know, when you're talking to people and sometimes people are like, you know what, I don't care, they deserve it, lock them up, throw them away the key, doesn't matter. Ultimately, the argument back to that is 95% of people in our country will be released back into our community. And so the question is, do we want better citizens or better criminals? And I know that regardless of your religion, regardless of your politics, we can all agree we want better citizens and not better criminals. So where did REAL begin? REAL began with this beautiful F2 pod of the Richmond City Jail. Why am I showing you this? A lot of people say, I just can't program. Like, I'd like to provide programs, but the conditions of the facility that I am at just do not allow it. We got terrible conditions, it's hot, there's bugs, it's loud, whatever the situation is, we just can't do it. It's not going to be ideal. It may be a little discouraging, but ultimately, if there's a will, there's a way. As I said, this is where we started. 120 men on this tier, bumps over to this side, triple bumped up to the top. Was not ideal, but guess what? Folks are there, folks are getting out. We have an obligation and a duty to provide programming, so when they get out, hopefully they'll have some different tools as when they came in. And so we really just made it work the best that we could, but that was the start of the REAL program. Back in 2013. We made things a little bit nicer in the jail. Pictures are in color. Here we are delivering programming after we had some order in place. But once again, these are the conditions of the old jail. We are programming where they sleep, where they eat, where they shower, where they go to the bathroom. Not ideal, but you gotta make it work. Going up a few years, we moved from the old, nasty, disgusting, hot, bug-infested Richmond City Jail over to the Richmond City Justice Center. Sparkly, shiny, new, perfect, ideal conditions for programming. So this gave us an opportunity to continue what we have started in the old jail to program in the new jail. So whether your facility looks like this or the former, something can be done to implement some type of programming, which many, of course, of you all are doing already. So what's the REAL program? It's a behavior modification program really that addresses trauma-informed care, where we work to address the behaviors that were associated with the criminality, which of course is what led to the incarceration, while doing what is much easier, working to equip them with the skills necessary to be successful upon release. That's the easy part, right? Like, we can teach somebody how to write a resume all day long, we can teach you how to apply for a job, we can even teach you how to do the budget. The trauma piece and the behavior piece is what is the absolute hardest piece there, but the most critical piece if any of us are going to be truly successful in what we do. So more on that in just a little bit. We had a study done by a professor, an independent professor, to look at the effectiveness of the REAL program and found that it was very effective, especially as it relates to lowering the rates of recidivism for people that are involved in the program. That said, we know that there's still some people, no matter how effective your program is, that are going to get out and come back. We also know that for the people that get out and don't come back, there are a million obstacles, right? Society is not waiting there with open arms saying, here's your job, here's your house, here's money, here's your cell phone. We all know it's the opposite, and it's hard, and that's why recidivism happens so much. So as a response to this, and just really getting call after call after call from men and women released from the REAL program, from the Richmond Jail, we decided to start Real Life, which is a nonprofit in the community that works with folks released from the REAL program, or at least that's how it started, to do things on a very small scale, to help with things like cell phones and bus tickets, things that are not readily available once you're released, but critical to your success. And y'all know this, but a lot of times people say, cell phones? Why do they need a cell phone, right? Well, think about it. If you don't have a phone, what phone number do you put down on a job application? You really can't get a job without a phone, but without a job, how do you get money to get the phone? Kind of a double whammy. So that's how we started. But one of the beautiful things about Real Life is that we respond to the needs of those that we serve. And so quickly we began to grow, quicker than anybody had planned or anticipated, but again, based upon the need. So about a year in, we opened a recovery house in South Richmond called, as you see, the Real House. This is not because of the lack of housing, recovery transitional housing in the Richmond area. It's because of the lack of affordable. Most places charge. Y'all know that. You work in this every day, right? Like, oh, well, we're happy to take them. Happy to reserve a bed. $800. Well, somebody coming out of incarceration or homelessness, the average person doesn't have that amount, especially somebody coming out of incarceration. So we decided to open the house because somebody's finances should not dictate whether they do or do not have access to recovery and safe, stable, sober housing. So we opened the house and let folks to move in for free, understanding their financial situation, have structure, have oversight, 4 pages of rules, curfew, randomized drug tests, great stuff. But we realized that's just not enough. Like, the house is operated on volunteers that have full-time jobs elsewhere, and the men living in our house really need holistic services for them. And then what about women? Women aren't living here. And then we were getting calls from people from prisons and other jails saying, can you help? We didn't have capacity. And then at the same time, getting calls from folks from the community asking for help. And short of saying, well, if you get locked up in Richmond, we got you covered, right? Like, we just didn't have the capacity to do that. So the next month, May of 2017, it was literally like a random conversation that said, what about something like a community center? One-stop shop anyone could come to get what they need. 6 months later, that random idea opened. And so this is what we call the Real Life Community Center. So right now, this is the main hub of operation. When we opened this, myself, Tashana, and a couple of our other staff members there left the jail to be at the community center full time. And so as I said, it opened as a one-stop shop for what somebody needs to overcome their adversities. Most of our folks, like the folks that you serve, are in adversities because of incarceration, homelessness, and or substance use disorder. And unfortunately, for most of the people that we serve, it's all of the above. So how do we do what we do? Here's our model. Don't think of this as a hierarchy, but more of a circle, because all of this is important. Why am I telling you this? Because I am encouraging you to implement all of these pillars into what you do daily. Because what we have found and what research has found is if we are able to implement a program that includes all of these pillars of service, we are going to get somebody to a point where they can sustain, and then more importantly, get them to a point of where they can thrive. So the first piece, and this is the first piece on this model, on our pillars of service, is sustained sobriety, right? We know that somebody, you could, maybe are a functional addict or a functional alcoholic, but you cannot be as successful as you could be if you were under the influence. That's whether you're in the community or whether you're in prison. You can provide the greatest program, but if you got somebody in prison that's under the influence, we know what happens, right? It's only going to do but so much. So we got to make sure they're at the point of sustained sobriety. After that, strengthening family. Research has shown us that the number one way to break the cycle of recidivism is by strengthening the family. That's it. Now, We know that for the population we serve, that is not a traditional family most of the time. That's not your mom, your dad, 2.5 kids, a cat and a dog, and your white picket fence, right? But that's okay. We're talking about strengthening the family, what that means for each individual. It's not one size fits all, and you're going to hear me say that throughout this presentation. It's individualized. Most often that means working on building bridges, reunifying with children, helping them overcome the anger, animosity, those sorts of things, hostility that has built up, most of the time rightfully so, right, over the years, but helping them strengthen and bridge that family relationship, which is going to be a huge focus of the next presentation. The next piece is meaningful employment. Y'all do an amazing job providing tons of opportunities for meaningful employment, technical training, those sorts of things. But I want you to notice that word meaningful. That's a critical piece. We're not talking about a lifetime minimum wage job at McDonald's, right? That's not going to sustain. That's certainly not going to get them to thrive. That's not going to get them to a point of being off government subsidies and those sorts of things. Now, we're also realistic. We know that sometimes you need a job before the job, but you got to have a job while you're working on getting to the job. And the job is the meaningful employment of a living wage, where you're not on government subsidies, where you have health care, where you have, sick leave and vacation and benefits that, frankly, most of the folks we work with never thought was realistic for them. Community interaction. Y'all, that's the hard one, right? Like, this is where we talk about living life on life terms. That's tough, and that is where the bulk of all of our work comes in, and that's where we focus the time, and that's really where the real life model spends the most of the work with the clients. We can teach you how to get that job, we can teach you how to sustain sobriety, but teaching you how to live on life on life terms, forget about it, is tough. That's where we see the behavior modification and the trauma-informed care piece. The end goal for community interaction is that all of your transactions are mutually beneficial, right? So I'm the inmate, I'm the offender, you're the correctional officer, and you look at me the wrong way. What are you doing, man? Why are you looking at me like that? That's not going to be mutually beneficial for a lot of reasons, right? We don't even have to go into why. However, I see you looking at me some type of way. I get in my feelings and I say, hey, can I talk to you, CO? You talk about it. That's going to be mutually beneficial, right? I'm going to respect you and you're going to respect me. And at the end of the day, I'm not going to be in isolation and you're not going to go out of the pod pissed, right? That's what we're looking at. But again, way easier said than done. We'll get to that a little bit more. And then the faith component. Just like you guys at DOC, that's not a mandatory part of our program, but it's optional if somebody wants it. We are a nonprofit organization. We are not faith-based, but we do have faith opportunities if somebody wants to engage in a spiritual faith-based component of it. If you do, great. If you don't, that's fine too. All the other services that we have will be available to you. So when somebody comes into the center, they will meet with a case manager right away. Now, most of the time when I ask somebody, what's a case manager, right? Well, somebody who manages a case, right? Wrong. A case manager is there for a relationship. And that's what I encourage you all to remember in your role. It's all about the relationship. You can have a case manager with the most resources in the world, the grant money to put you into housing and all of that. But if when your offender comes in, you say, what do you want? When do you get out? Yeah, I'll set up housing. I don't care what resources you have, that relationship has blown it. Whereas you may be that case manager, that counselor that has a heart, that cares, that has that. You may not have all the resources, but the fact that you are willing to be there and hear them and be in a relationship, that is going to make the difference of whether somebody succeeds on the outside and the inside or not. Now, I'm not talking about inappropriate relationship, right? Like, we have boundaries. We have very strict boundaries. We have professional boundaries, right? But there are things within those boundaries that we all can do to be in a better relationship with the people that we serve. So some examples, and I would encourage you to think personally and professionally how you can be in a better relationship with the people that you serve, which will equate to a much better outcome at the end, right? So I know that you all have some guidelines and things of what you can call them and what they can call you, right? So if it's Mr. or Mrs., that's fine. But hey you, can you go do this? That's not personal. That's not building a relationship. So even if it is, hey Miss Scarbrough, hey Miss Gilmore, that's okay. But right there is building a relationship. You know, hey, you look a little down today. What's going on? Are you okay? Most likely, what's the response going to be? I'm good. But the fact that you took the time to observe that something was going on is right there helping build a relationship and showing them that at least one person cares. That's huge. So keep that in mind, and I encourage you to think of how you can be in better relationships with the people that you serve. So, people come in, meet with the case manager, go through a criminogenic risk assessment, identify the needs and the risk factors most highly associated with reoffending, reusing. Sound familiar? Like y'all's compass, right? The information here is critical. Now, understand that y'all are understaffed, you got a lot of offenders you work with, right? But once again, this is not a one-size-fits-all. So you really need to think about how can I incorporate this person's compass, this person's risk factors with what I am doing and how I am tailoring a plan for them. So this is an example of a criminogenic risk assessment in the output of one of our offenders. So I'll read it to you because it's super, super small, but this guy has a 70% chance of recidivism within 3 years of release. So basically he's going back, right? Like that rate is super high. His number one risk factor that you can't see right here, and I can barely see, a good thing I have it memorized, is leisure and pro-social activities. That's weird. A lot of people think, what does that have to do with things? Well, let me break it down for you. He grew up in Mosby Court. Anybody know Mosby Court in Richmond?
Projects.
Yeah, the projects, that's right. If you don't know, it's the projects, very crime-infested, gang-infested, murder-infested, drug-infested, everything else under the sun. So this guy grew up there in a gang-banging, gun-slinging, drug-dealing, drug-doing family, right? That's what he grew up in. What are his leisure activities? What I just said. Right. People are going to do things with their time. So if somebody who has this does not come up with positive pro-social activities, what's going to happen? They're going back. So this guy's number one risk factor is leisure activities. We got to teach them. The second one, finances. Drug dealers used to have a wad of money in their pocket. Without that wad of money, what happens? Temptation. God, if I just sell that one bag. And that's where most people stop their train of thought. But look on the other end, right? You decide to hold it out, not get that bag, get food stamps, go to food pantries, whatever, but you get paid. And you cash that check and it's a $400 wad in your pocket. Boom, temptation is there because you have money again. And what did you used to do with money? That's a big thing. This next one is housing. We talked about that and so on and so forth. Here's just a colorful, more pretty graphic illustration of what I just was talking about and what I just showed you with the risk assessment. With this information, we put together a personal plan. So each person gets a plan that is tailored to them that addresses their risk factors. We, at a time, and initially are going to work at 3 risk factors at a time. Research has shown that working on more than 3 tracks, more than 3 goals at a time is just too much and too overwhelming for the people we serve. So we work with 3 things at a time. We assign them groups, classes, services, counseling, mental health, whatever that goes in with it. And this is just examples. This is page 1. Some are 2 pages, some are 5 pages, just depending there. But this is an example of what they are assigned and recommended to do at the community center. So now the hard part. Y'all ready for this? Who's heard of trauma-informed care? A couple of y'all. So, let me preface this section with this. This is not an us versus them conversation, right? This is an us conversation. They have experienced trauma, many of them, but many of us have too. And so what I'm about to go into is some deep trauma stuff. And so just like it's going to probably affect the people that we serve, it could affect some of us. This could be bringing up stuff that you have suppressed for a long time that you've not wanted to deal with. And so I want to preface it with, this is, critical information to serve our people better, but you also need to remember yourself and self-care for yourself. So if you start feeling some type of way when I'm going through this and get emotional, you are welcome to just like tune me out, walk out of the room, go do whatever you need. After, if something's going on, I'm happy to talk, or just make sure to engage in self-care so that you don't, this is not detrimental information to you. But what is trauma? Something really bad that happens that has a lasting effect, right? So if you really want to get into the definition of trauma, you want to look at the 3 E's, okay? Your event, your experience, and therefore the effect. That's critical. So, the event, me and Ronnie, our brother and sister, right? Ronnie's my big brother, protective big brother. Unfortunately, Dad beats Mom. So when Dad gets to hitting Mom at night, Ronnie scoops me up, brings me to the room, gives me my blankie, kisses me on the head, puts me on my bed, closes the door, and then goes back out to try to pull Dad off of Mom, all right? So Ronnie and I have been through the same event, right? But our experience of that event is totally different, right? Therefore, the effect of that event is going to be totally different. And that's for 2 people in the same household, right? How many of y'all have people you work with and say, well, we've been through the same situation, and why did this happen to me and that not happen to them, right? It's the same situation. The way that people process and cope with things are different, in addition to the event, the experience, and the effect of the traumatic situation. So keep that in mind for yourself and for the folks that you work with. So what could cause trauma? A ton of different things. There are tons of things that can cause trauma. But remember the 3 E's. Just because something is traumatic for me also doesn't mean that it's going to be traumatic for you. Right? So maybe I moved in high school and that was the most devastating, traumatic thing in the world. But maybe you moved in middle school and that was the greatest thing in the world, right? So what's traumatic for me may not be traumatic for you or the other person. Keep that in mind. So y'all have heard this thing that we supposedly have going on, right? Called opioid epidemic. Y'all heard about that? Wrong. I mean, I'm not saying you haven't heard of it, but what I'm saying is it really an opioid epidemic? I would venture to say no. It's a trauma epidemic. But people don't want to talk about that because trauma is even harder to talk about than an addiction to a substance, right? It's like talking about mental health. There's a stigma, it's scary, and it's embarrassing, right? But what we have going on is this trauma epidemic where we are not getting to the root cause of why people are doing what they do. And if we don't get to the root cause, if we don't know the problem, we're never going to get to the solution. Certainly not the long-term solution. And the problem is trauma. The trauma that people go through. So these are just some statistics right here of the prevalence of trauma. But the basics is 1 in 4 people, 1 in 4 adults have been through significant trauma. So if you think about that, you're at lunch, sitting at a table with 4 people. Statistics say that 1 in 4 of you have been through some serious stuff. Those are some high statistics, right? So how do we measure this? Who has heard of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences? I knew my brother has heard of this. Yeah, Rodney. Sister. Or Ronnie, yeah. We grew up in that same household, so we know trauma, right? We know ACEs. ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. This is right here, this is what y'all need to take. So ACEs started on the West Coast at a weight loss clinic, all right? There were some doctors there that delivered some awesome services to women that were significantly overweight. I mean, like 1, 2, 3, 400 pounds overweight. And they had great results with the women losing the weight. But keeping the weight off was a different story. And the doctors started realizing and wondering, what's the difference between that woman who loses the weight and keeps it off versus the woman that loses the weight and regains it? And so he starts sitting down and talking to the women, and he's the doctor, so he needs to figure it out. And one afternoon, he sat down and started talking to the first person, just developing a dialogue, see if he could pull anything from it. And she had mentioned that she was sexually molested as a child. And he said, that's weird. In my 20 years of experience as a doctor, I've only ever talked to one other person that has shared that they were sexually abused. So he said, well, this is probably the second one. I'm not going to hear of another one in 20 years, right? Well, that afternoon, he met number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6. And said, we need to do a study. There's something with women who have been sexually abused as a child and this weight loss thing. So they then did a study on 17,000 people and found the difference is the adverse childhood experiences that people had been through, versus what happened to them as an adult. And the number of health disparities of people who had ACEs or who had been through traumatic experiences as a child was extremely high, right? And so, so the way that you measure this is through an ACE test. As I said, average childhood experience. So the ACE test is 10 questions that review the 10 most significant traumas that a child can go through, right? And so it's looking at abuse, physical, sexual, emotional, and mental abuse. It's looking at neglect. So are you feeling unsafe, uncared for, not going to the doctors, and unnurtured at your home? And then looking at other factors within the home. Were your parents incarcerated, on drugs, mental health illnesses, or were they divorced or separated? And so the ACE test goes through the series of those questions. Now, it's meant for an adult to take, but it's asking if the following happened to you between the ages of 0 and 18. So if I say yes, so yes, I was sexually abused. Yes, my parents were divorced before the age of 18. I will give myself a score of a 1 next to that question, all right? If I say no, so no, my parents were not divorced. No, my parents were not in jail. I give myself a score of a 0. So at the end of the test, you're going to add up your 10 numbers and have between a 0 and a 10. 10 being the most significant trauma that you could have gone through as a child, and a 0 being the other end of the spectrum with no significant trauma in a child's life. All right? So think about that, and then look at these statistics associated with a score of a 4 or more. As I said, health disparities galore. So this is the point of the presentation where I beg you not to leave. If you've made it this far, please stay. And this is the part that you don't want your offenders getting up and walking away. Because at this point, it's like, well, pack up and go home, right? There is no hope. This sucks. Oh, and by the way, if I have a 6 or more, you are projected to die 20 years earlier than if you have a lower score. Like, well, why do we even do what we do then if this is what it is? Well, the good news is these are public health statistics. These are not yours or yours or your statistics, right? The great news is that your trauma is not your destiny. Something can happen. There can be intervention. You can raise your resilience as an individual. But guess what? That's our role, to help be that intervention to disturb these statistics that are out there so that our clients, our offenders' trauma is not their destiny, right? So a lot of people say, all right, so what is the difference between, well, let me ask you this. What do you think the average ACE score of men incarcerated in America is? 7, right? So that tells us really what we know and see and deal with every day. That people behind bars in our country have gone through some stuff. There's some really hurt people. Some of them are bad, but most of them aren't. They just made some bad decisions, but they're actually good people, right? Women's average ACE score is right under that at about a 6.5, all right? So a lot of times I get asked the question, so what's the difference between the person who's a 7 that ends up in jail, on drugs, in a life of crime, versus the person with a 7 that defies the odds, right? And one of the big things is the 3 E's. The event, the experience, and the effect. That has a huge part of it. But remember, everybody who goes through something is going to cope with it. Everybody. And there's 2 ways to cope. Negative or positive, right? And most of the people that we work with cope in a negative way because they don't know how to cope any better. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But think about it. That 9-year-old that gets molested, how do they cope with it? Well, maybe tip back the bottle, right? Like, I don't want to think about what Uncle John did to me last night. So I'm just going to get drunk. But once that drunk wears off, I have to feel again. And I know that Uncle John's coming over tomorrow. So I got to get drunk again because I don't want to feel what I know is going to happen when he gets over there. So I get drunk again. And look at how that cycle for a young kid starts because they don't want to feel what's going on, right? Look at how that cycle starts. Do you think that they're going to get to a point that's like, oh, I can go ahead and feel this so I don't have to drink anymore? No, it's going to continue. And sadly, it's going to continue with other things. You know, most of the time, like if I'm teaching a trauma class or something to our clients, I'll say, what are the top 2 things that people do or people engage in for negative coping styles? And most of the time you say drinks or drugs. Right. And those are correct, right? I get drunk, I get high so I don't have to feel. But there are so many other things, which often those that we work with look over and don't think about as being negative coping or numbing mechanisms. But they're things that are instant gratification. Make me feel good right now, right? I have sex, oh, that makes me feel good right now. Maybe even sex with a prostitute, because that's an even bigger rush, right? What about that wad of money that just gives me a rush? The jewelry, the flyest clothes, the newest Jordans. What about bullying, right? I'm going to tear you down because that's going to build me up. Fighting, violence, carrying a gun, joining a gang. All of those are those instant gratification, adrenaline rush, make me feel good right now, gives me dopamine hits to my brain so I don't have to feel, I don't have to think about it. But as I said, all of those things are instant gratification. It goes away. And when it goes away, I'm left to feel. And I don't want to feel because I don't want to remember that pain. So I keep on going and going. So think about that 9-year-old who started drinking and engaging in those other behaviors. How many of those 9-year-olds are now adults that are sitting in the prisons that you work in? And as an adult, they still don't know how to cope with what Uncle John did. They still don't know how to cope with the fact that their mom ignored that. They still don't know how to cope with the fact that their dad was locked up. So as a 50-year-old person, they're doing the same daggone thing that they were doing as a 9-year-old. Right? Make you think about things a little different? About the way that we serve people a little different? Right? So, positive coping, on the other hand, right? The person that went through that same situation, but doesn't go to that. The difference between those 2 people is their level of resilience. Their ability to bounce back in that negative or adverse situation, right? And how you know how somebody has a high or low resilience is related to 3 things. Relationships, communication, and connection. It's all about relationships. If you have a relationship with somebody, you are connected to them, therefore you are communicating with them. Why is that important? Because research has shown us that the number 1 way to cope with things is to talk about it. So if we do not have relationships with somebody, we are not talking about it, therefore we are not coping in a positive way, the number 1 positive way that research has shown. Do y'all remember earlier when I talked about what's your role as a case manager or counselor? It's relationships. Y'all connecting the dots now as to why I'm saying that, right? So,
most of the time, those that we serve, that relationship is not at home, which makes our role even more critical, right? Because the ACEs are not things going on in the community. They're the things going on at home. So most often that relationship is not with somebody at home that's, a biological or any type of caregiver. It might be with the counselor, with the pastor, with the teacher, with the coach, but it's with somebody else. And if they don't have that somebody else, they are going to seek comfort and safety and fulfillment of that loss from somebody that they shouldn't, on that negative side of coping. So, some quick things to do to help. What can I do today? What I am not giving you information to do is to go back to your prison and do a big lesson on trauma, because that's going to do more damage. Like, I preface this with you all, we're put together, or at least semi. At least we got up and got dressed and came to work today, right? So we're at least semi put together on the outside. If some of us can't handle it, do you think that some of the most broken people in the world can handle it like that? No way. You cannot go in and say, hey, do this ACE test for me. You are asking them to relive the most traumatic events of their life that have really resulted into where they are today. So if you want to execute trauma, which is incredible to do, you have got to plan it, and it's got to be a slow process to figure out how you slowly deliver, how you slowly execute, how you have mental health on board, and all of those resources together. And we can certainly talk about that another time, but this information is more for you, to give you an understanding to better serve, better address, and better work with the people and that you work with every day, right? So understanding that trauma and how it has played an effect in their life. An important part here is when we understand their behaviors or how their behaviors are associated with their traumas, we're really able to deliver services through a trauma-informed lens. What does that mean? That means that we are now going to respond to a need and not the behavior. What? We're going to respond to the need and not the behavior. So we know that there's rules, right? Somebody gets to fighting. We're not going to give you a free pass. This is not about just like letting behaviors go slipping under the rug. No. But ultimately, if we do not respond to the need, the behaviors will continue. So what does that mean? That person that has never had a say-so in their entire life, they've never been able to control a thing. Their parents are always gone, so they haven't felt nurtured. Trauma is all about feeling unsafe, and then recovery from it is fulfilling the loss and trying to feel safe again, right? So that person without control that gets to fighting all the time, fighting gives them control. So if we do not fulfill their need for control, the fighting is going to continue. So this is where you got to be creative. This is where you have to be creative. Ronnie is the only name tag up close that I can see, so I'm going to keep on picking on you, right? But, hey, today we've got two things going on. I need the toilets scrubbed and I need the floors mopped. Which one would you like to do, right? You're giving them control. That's control that you can let go and give them an opportunity to make a choice for their own. So you're answering the need instead of always responding to the behavior, right? You're going to respond to the fight, but you're also going to respond to the need when they're acting all right, so that hopefully those things can start chiseling down. You need to change the dialogue. It's not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, right? So obviously we all work with adults, but this is something that is like so critical, especially when we're working with kids, right? Like how many times do kids get in trouble, they act out of school, they start, fighting another kid, and it's like, what is wrong? Why are you doing that, right? But if we just had a chance to say, what happened? They could say, well, last night I was up all night because there was gunshots out of my window and my neighbor got murdered. So I'm just really irritable and tired today. That's going to change some things. That takes it from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And now we know what happened so we can help deal with it instead of escalating the problem worse, right? Here's a few things that we don't want to talk about, that we don't want to say,
just a few pointers. I'm not going to read them all. You guys can see them and read them. But a story that I'm going to leave you with. Has anybody heard of Allison Sampson Jackson? No? All right, Google her, read, or listen to her TED Talk. It's on trauma. It's 15 minutes long. I swear to you, it will not be a waste of your time. Incredible stuff, all right? So, does anybody here work? Probably not, but does anybody here work at Red Onion? No? Anybody have? Okay, y'all know what it is, though. So, Allison actually used to be a kind of on contract for DOC. And there's a guy, I know this is shocking, right? But there's a guy that was just off the chain at Red Onion. So they just couldn't get him settled. Nothing they would do. He was tearing up everything, wreaking havoc, and they called Allison and said, we need help. And she said, okay, but I need one thing from you. I need to have clearance to bring in a ball. This is prison, not PE. Why do you need a ball? But Allison got her way because she's so good. She's the one that trained me in all of my trauma and all of that, right? So she brings in the ball. And here this guy is off the chain, hooting, hollering, all this type of stuff. She starts walking up to him. Slowly, open stance, not threatening, and starts throwing the ball. Well, what does he do? He catches it, throws it back. Here they go, playing ball. She's connecting with him. If you're playing ball with somebody and you're trying to catch it, you're not looking this way. You're connected with them, right? Why do we connect? So anybody seen the hand-brain demonstration? You're about to. Great news, right? Shock. All right, so here's your brain. We're not going to do your brain on drugs. We're past that, right? Here's your brain. This is your brain stem, all right? This is your, right here, brain stem. This is the part of your brain where you don't think about things. You just do it. This is where you breathe from, your cholesterol, your blood pressure, all of those things, all right? This is your upstairs brain, all right? This is your logic, your learning, your judgment. This, your thumb, is your downstairs brain. This is your sensory. This is your emotions. This is your fight, flight, or freeze response, okay? When your brain is like this, your logic, your judgment, your learning, your senses, your emotions, it's all intact. Right now, hopefully I haven't pissed anybody off too much, but this is how our brains are right now. We're logical, we're thinking, right? However, have you ever had a moment where you just flip your lid, something happens and you just blow up, and then after you're like, I cannot believe I just said that. That wasn't me. I didn't really mean it like that. Have y'all ever had that happen? Yeah, that's because you're operating in your downstairs brain, right? I'm not thinking, this is my husband, I love you dearly, and I'm here to respect you. I'm thinking, you left your damn dirty laundry on the floor again, and it pisses me off. That's my downstairs brain. I'm not thinking of our relationship. I'm not thinking of the consequences of yelling at you and cussing you out. I'm not thinking logically. I'm not judging. I'm thinking of my emotions. I'm thinking I'm going to fight you, I'm going to freeze, or I'm going to flee. And in that situation, when you leave your dirty laundry on the floor, I'm going to fight you, right? But then, when I come back down and my brain is reconnected, I'm like, baby, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Like, I'm just really sorry. Forgive me. Until next time, right? Now, don't you leave your laundry on the floor again. So think about it. The people that we serve, most of them always are operating in their downstairs brain because they're always on survival mode, right? So let's go back to that story. How do you think most correctional officers were dealing with him? I told you to stop doing that. I told you to stop yelling. Are you ever going to make any progress? Nope, because they're operating in their downstairs brain. They are in survival mode. They are running on emotions. They are not thinking cognitively. They're not using good judgment. They're not reasoning. But when I can connect with you by doing that, passing that ball or whatever way, then guess what? You are getting them out of survival mode. They are starting to think, and then at that point, you can redirect them. You have to connect before you can redirect. And for people that have dealt with significant trauma, that is even more heightened than dealing with somebody that has coped positively or has not dealt with that trauma.